We have 4 colleagues from the IDRC who are going to be presenting and having this discussion from the funders' perspective. We have Alejandra Vagra Gracia, we have Marcus Gottbacher, and then we also have Ajan Dihan and Jessica Kadinsky. All 4 of them are going to engage in this discussion and provide the challenges and the potentials of intersectional grant making from the funders' perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Melody, and thank you, Saviva. I believe I go first. I'm here. My name is Arjan Daan. I'm a project officer at IDRC, and there's a fairly large group of colleagues, including in the room here. I'm currently in our the IDRC headquarters in Ottawa, which is based on the unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people. And this is a fantastic discussion. I hope we're, as funders, are not going to take, I know you don't, that we're not going to take over this discussion, but provide the perspective why we have engaged in this work, and with that to say the collaboration with Saviva and other colleagues has been fantastic on this, and this is a learning process for us, and that's really, I think, the most important thing for us to say those recommendations that we're already seeing that have been presented are absolutely critical, and we are in a process to see how we are going to incorporate this in our work, and the issue of doing that with partners in the South is absolutely central to that. But I'll give you a little bit of the history. So I think it is helpful for colleagues to to understand a little bit of that perspective of funders. IDRC, for people who don't know, we're part of the Canadian Development Program, and we were set up about 50 years ago, more than 50 years ago now, to support research in the global South, to support the research of local research to address local problems. In that history, I think it's, and is well before me, some of my colleagues can speak much better. In that history, we've done, IDRC has done excellent work incorporating issues of inequality, and I particularly want to highlight the work on gender that IDRC has supported. And importantly, for our thinking here is that our quest for how can we incorporate intersectionality very much came out of discussions of better integrating gender into all our research. IDRC has always had strong programming on gender, on issues of violence against women in health, on women's economic empowerment, across a range of issues. I think it's fair to say that as all organizations, that the strength of such work goes through waves. And I think maybe about 5-7 years ago, we came to a point like we need to, while we continue to have good programs on gender, IDRC needs to do more to integrate gender more. And we always said gender and inclusive, but I'll come back to that in a moment, to integrate gender more systematically into our programming. And I think it's fair to say the leadership of the gender groups are somehow here, and I'm kind of speaking on their behalf, but I think it's fair to say that IDRC too experienced challenges in doing that systematically, and that is partly related to the fact that, as I said, there's always been excellent gender programs and gender projects, but integrating gender in areas that IDRC also works on, for example, on infectious diseases, or particularly on animal health, for example. As like colleagues say, it's like, hey, you need to tell us more about what the relevance is and how we can work on gender. So that's been a learning process over the last 5-7 years. In that, and that of course was under the Canadian Feminist International Assistance Policy, which gave here in Canada gave us a strong driver to, and the recognition we always need to do more on it. And quickly to say, in that we use the framework of gender transformational gender approaches, gender transformational approaches, transformational approaches to gender analysis. So in that, in many of those discussions, and I think it's fair to say we always applied over the last 5 years, developed a framework, an ongoing process of developing a framework of gender and uh, um, uh, uh, other identities, gender and in inclusion, and within that, throughout that period, the question of those other identity and the question of uh, what intersectionality means in that approach has continued to inform that discussion. But really, and if you see the recommendations here, we really are already taking this at heart. So like, yeah, we need to do more to inform our thinking here. I think there were about 3-4 reasons why we highlighted intersectionality as a key issue to do more on. I think, and this very much mirrors the kind of timeline that Sevilla presented. I think during the pandemic, during the Black Lives Matter movement, there was a clear understanding, like, hey, IDRC too, internally as well as in our programming, how are we going to respond to that? As I said, we use the transformation and the framework of transformational gender analysis, and intersectionality is actually part of that definition. So it always popped up in our discussion, but we realized that is much, to put it simply, that's much easier said than done. And I think many of our colleagues said, like, hey, we need to have a better understanding on how to do that. And then the last thing is that for me personally, and I want to just acknowledge that the reason that I picked it up as a project officer here, and the credit to that, I think, goes to WeGo, with one of the case studies is prepared by WeGo, of course. And it was actually Marty Chen, one of the founders of WeGo, that during a meeting on gender in Ottawa said, he said the future of gender analysis is in intersectionality. And that always stuck with me. At that point of time, I didn't know how relevant it was, but now that I see the work of which, I completely understood why she said that at that point of time, and that's where I want to end. IDRC is really, we understand we need to do more on this. We understand that any issues of inequalities, particularly structural inequalities, are always hard to address. We are committed to working with Southern Research. That's our mandate, to promote this, and this work is just helping us to understand what we need to do to integrate that better. And the final thing to say, we think is not just for IDRC. We very much first want to have a good understanding of the implications at IDRC, but also are very keen to share it with other research funders, so that we can promote the practices that Saviv and others now are highlighting in the best possible way. Thank you so much, WITS colleagues, for hosting this, and this is a fantastic discussion, and we're learning so much from it already. Back to you, Melody. I think we're going to pass over to Jessica now.
Thank you so much for the introduction from the funders' perspective. We are going to go to Jessica Kadinsky. She's also with the RDRC, and she's going to also give comments before handing over to her other colleagues. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you find yourselves. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this very exciting conversation. I know it's the second in the Set of Learning series. I've had the pleasure of reviewing the first one, which is a wonderful testament to the recording of these sessions and their legacy after the session live. So I'm really excited to participate and engage and mostly learn. My name is Jessica Kadinsky. I have recently joined the IDRC about 4 weeks ago as the Gender Equality and Inclusion Advisor. So I work with all of the programs and other departments across the center to promote gender transformative approaches. As I mentioned, I've been on board for about 5 minutes, so I will not be discussing specifically from an IDRC perspective. My colleagues here today have much more experience and will be able to provide much more color and texture to this conversation around from a funder's point of view. But I wanted to bring in my my own experience and reflections as a practitioner and an academic prior to joining IDRC, and also connecting it to what I've been hearing so far, and perhaps some questions for us to think about, and connecting back to many of the points that Siviwe very expertly laid out in the beginning of the session. So I wanted to just acknowledge a little bit that a point that Siviwe alluded to, which is that intersectionality is actually a contested term. There's actually quite a lively debate for various reasons about its historicity, about its origins, about how it's been adopted and co-opted. And I don't want to wade into this debate per se, but I just wanted to share and highlight that this debate is, I think, well, first of all, I think we can take a lot of things as being instructive from this debate. I think a lot of the critiques around intersectionality being the whitening, for example, of intersectionality, as Surma Bilge has written about, Patricia Hill Collins has also written about sort of those co-optations. I think it's something to keep in mind as we have these conversations, that intersectionality is not a given, it is not unproblematic, and it is not sort of served up as Siviwe said, as sort of an overly technical exercise or something to sort of tick box. And this is something that I was thinking about when reflecting on some of the questions prior to today, which is, what are the strengths of intersectionality, and how can this apply to funding of international development research? So when I think about the strengths, I think about the capacity of intersectionality and frameworks that can be overlaid or overlapped on intersectionality, but may not be called as such for various reasons, as was highlighted in many of the case studies in this project. And the capacity to really understand inequality as being rooted in history and historical processes, that they don't just appear out of nowhere and they don't exist discretely or in a vacuum. And I think this really helps us to understand the origins and also tackle the root causes. The second thing, and I think perhaps this is maybe the foundational strength of intersectionality and such frameworks, is that it really helps us to think not so much on a single axis, not only on gender, not only on race, not only on fill in the blank, whichever part of identity or experience you are interested in learning about or understanding more, but it compels us to think in a multiple axis way. And by that I mean thinking about things together, how not only they sort of exist in parallel, but also mutually constituting, mutually reinforcing. And this came out very, very well in the 8 case studies in this project. And for anyone who hasn't had a chance to look through those, I really encourage you to do so. I think also in terms of opportunities, Siviwe mentioned the fluidity or the flexibility or the vagueness of intersectionality, and how this can actually be a strength in terms of adapting and adopting to specific contexts and economies and communities. And I think that's a really important point for us to keep in mind here at the center, but then sort of more broadly in terms of finding opportunities to promote and to support different collaborations and different alliances and different ways of working and different partners to work with. And I'll come back to this point in a minute. And I think, as I mentioned, you know, in relation to that sort of matrix, resisting a single axis way of thinking, intersectionality really compels us to work horizontally, recognizing that power dynamics exist not only in between groups or intergroup or intercommunities, but also within groups. So really troubling this notion that any group, whether it's a community or a household or an institution or an economy, is somehow monolithic, is troubled by applying an intersectionality lens. And I think that that is amongst one of the strengths. So how can we, as you know, as funders and as people interested in mobilizing intersectionality towards making lasting and impactful progress, how can we take this on board? I think from what was clear to me reading through the case studies and reviewing the material for today is, I think it's important for us, especially at the center, and I think this is being done, but just a reminder and to highlight that we need to be intentional about why we are tackling and trying to understand intersectionality and how it can be used. It's not just a tick box or technical exercise, but rather really getting to the deep roots of why are we doing this? Does it, you know, and I would argue, you know, a starting point is it is our programs, it is our work. You know, it's not that it's something, you know, a parallel or add-on, but it actually makes our work better. It helps us to understand not only the research, its products and its findings, but then also how we go about doing the work. And so I think that those two things, the what we fund and the how we fund, important things to be thinking very intentionally about. And I think these conversations are, you know, evidence that we're on that path. And I'm really excited to be a part of those conversations. And again, learning from our partners, especially those in the Global South, and grantees, and really learning from experiences. I think for me, when I was reading, as an aside, I'm really excited that Dr. Hanifa is here and will speak later, because when I was reading the work of the Women's Media Collective, something that jumped out to me was that thinking about intersectionality beyond simply identity and identity markers, but then also connecting that with experience. And so thinking about things like, you know, if someone is a survivor of violence, whatever type of violence that may be, they may be labeled as a survivor as an identity, but actually it's the experience that drives that identity to be placed upon or assumed by a certain individual or group. And so I think really understanding those, you know, expanding out our understanding of intersectionality and what constitutes those sort of interlocking bricks in, if we think about a model of a brickwork, is really important. And I think also, and I'll wrap up soon and hand it over to my colleague in a minute, I think also using our positionality within the donor community, and now I'm speaking as a new member of IDRC, is really important to reflect upon in terms of power asymmetries. Yes, we can think about and check our power and do that in an intentional way and resist the performativity of doing positionality checks, and moving beyond sort of the naming and then to sort of the understanding how that impacts our work and how that impacts our how we support and what we fund and how we fund. But then also using that positionality to influence and encourage and bring along like-minded donors who are also working in this space. And how can we use our role to sort of advocate for more intersectional research and more funding. And then the very last point I will make before I kick it back to Melody, who then will kick it to Ale, is something that I've been thinking about and talking with colleagues, which is how do we support movement building? So as Saviwe mentioned in her presentation, working towards and supporting movement building, you know, on the backs of, or rather like inspired by research outcomes, but how can we do that along the process? And perhaps that was also contained in that point as well. But just to highlight that we may need to look at supporting and working with different actors, sort of the unusual suspects, perhaps, and I know there are some mechanisms at IDRC to support, you know, smaller groups, grassroots organizations, more activist leaning groups, and bringing people together. And so that convening and that support to movement building, I think, is a key role that I see that IDRC and other funders can play. I'm looking forward to hearing the others on the panel, and I will kick it to Melody. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jessica. For those of you who are interested in the case study, the link has been posted in the chat box, so you can click on that and go and have a read of the 8 case studies that were done from different parts of the world. Jessica made mention of in her discussion. Jessica, as she pointed out, is with the IDRC, and she has recently began as a gender inequality inclusion advisor. And next up, we have Alexandra. She is a senior program specialist at the International Development Research Center, and she specializes in gender equality, education, and social economic inclusion research and programming. Over to you, Alejandra.
Thank you, Melody. And thank you again to Saviwe and Melody and the team for organizing this learning session and for inviting us to be part of it. Marcus and I, or the last voices you'll hear from IDRC, are commenting a little bit more as program officers on what are some of the recommendations or the considerations we think are important on how to really facilitate an intersectional lens being applied in the projects that we have the pleasure to support. From a kind of grant maker's perspective, what's the nuance in the day-to-day that we think is important to keep in mind? And as was said by Arian and others, At present, of course, IDRC has not had a prescriptive kind of one given approach to how we promote intersectional research. We do, however, have a history of supporting those principles being implemented in different ways. This was showcased in the case studies that Sibiwe just alluded to, and models that we have, including kind of RQ Plus and others. I think on the positive side, what this offers us is kind of a lot of flexibility as program officers and as partners to really implement the principles that we think are most important and support approaches as we see fit. But I think on the challenges side, I think it can contribute to ad hoc application, missed opportunities to really look at some of the best practices where we can more intentionally see, okay, are we asking the most foundational questions of, is our research really reaching those that need it the most? Are we really emphasizing the voices of those that should be leading these processes in the project design, in our dissemination practices, and really facilitate embedding that better into our system? So I think conversations like today are particularly important to bring back some of that intentionality as part of the gender leadership team into some of our frameworks and approaches more systematically, while keeping, of course, some of that important flexibility. I think, however, if you see Sibiwe's remarks and read the case studies, what you're going to see is that our partners across the Global South, particularly those that come from the social sciences, predominantly do support the application of intersectional research principles. And it's not hard to understand why. As I think about some of the projects I've supported with LGBTQ plus groups seeking justice and rights protection in the context of post-peace agreement in Colombia, it's not hard to understand why, you know, our partners don't need to overly theorize about how different experiences and identities interlock and lead to distinct pathways and lived experiences. This is our partners' lived reality. So I think a first recommendation or best practice that I think we can be more intentional, not just at IDRC, but like-minded organizations, is how do we create systems that allow us to iteratively consult these very partners to understand which are the principles that they deem are most important, what are some of the practices from a grant-making perspective that facilitate them living those principles and implementing them, what are the ones that hinder that process, so we can improve on our kind of grant-making processes and also foster network building and opportunities to promote peer learning across these partners. And I think a lot of our MEL systems are well set up to capture how well are we doing on outputs, or how well are we doing in advancing the outcomes of any given project. But the L piece of the monitoring, evaluation, and learning is missing a little bit. I think we're missing an opportunity to really kind of get together, and we don't often have evaluations of programming look at these questions, which is, again, to what degree, you know, are we reaching those that are most marginalized? How are questions really examining intersecting forms of oppression? Are we really getting those research questions to be as nuanced as they can be and complex, or are we oversimplifying the process or facilitating our partners to do so? And then, again, collecting feedback from our research partners, and we'll hear from some of them, on what are those practices and approaches that we can help them to develop and support so they can do this process more organically and better over time. Second kind of recommendation of best practice, as I think about the core principles of intersectional research, I think a critical one being, you know, context specificity, then of course supporting the application of that principle really does require us to think about how is the duration that we give to projects, the resource envelope that we give to projects, and the work plans that we require partners to provide really allow for a deep familiarization with that local context early on, and really allow adaptability amid context changes that happens in the project cycle to reflect that local context and nuance. And that might mean, from a donor's and perspective, to get really comfortable with the fact that the methodological approaches and the work plan is not going to be spelled out from the beginning, right? And as you're doing a call for proposals, and we're, part of the principles of intersectionality is to embrace, you know, methodological plurality, then this has to be a co-design process with a lot of the local organizations and partners that should be brought to the table. And it's going to be messy and it's going to take time and it's not going to be perfectly spelled out in a grant agreement. And we have to get comfortable with some of that flexibility and unknown and letting really partners lead in this process. And also means really ensuring in a meaningful way that the selection of partners is rooted in the local communities. Really balancing out some of the best projects I've seen from a research standpoint tend to be consortium models that bring together researchers, but also civil society organizations, people who really understand and live in the context in which any research question is intending to provide an answer for addressing a local, social, or economic problem. But that also begets as an organization a commitment to capacity building, whereas you're putting together or supporting that these partnerships emerge where there's added value from what the impact will be. There's also needs to strengthen technical support, maybe on research quality, on supporting methodologies, and supporting exchange and supporting knowledge translation, on investing in capacity building and institutional strengthening beyond just the research itself being carried out. Third, I think Jessica spoke to this a little bit, which is understanding our positionality as a funder. I think as one of the core principles of intersectional research is to highlight hierarchical power dynamics, relations, policies, ideologies. I think it would be hypocritical for us not to understand very clearly what our positionality as a funder is, what is some of the historical context of colonialism, of oppression, and then recognize currently what our funder privileges are and potentially our blindfolds in understanding the lived realities of the partners we support. And then being on active listening mode to what those context needs might be, and reflecting that in things including our safeguarding practices to make sure that they're co-designed with partners to truly be as responsive as possible to the context in which our partners work and live. And then one advantage I think that we have, at least within IDRC, is we have regional offices. And I think if leveraged correctly, what this offers us is the ability to really build strong, sustained relationships with partners in the Global South over time, where we are based. I am based in Latin America. I have the pleasure of knowing some of these partners more intimately and living in some of these contexts, not without, of course, my own privilege, but having regional offices really allows us the opportunity to have nuanced intelligence on what are some of the local contexts, the power dynamics, and to help make sure that that informs a long-term research strategy that we should pursue from headquarters, from Ottawa, in supporting partners. And then the last piece is, I think, IDRC and other like-minded organizations, as much as we speak about intersectionality, there's also been a great push for talking about the decolonization of knowledge as an ambition, and I think a worthwhile discussion. I think what it begets us to do from a funder perspective is, as we think about some of the big collaborations with funders, including spaces like the Transatlantic Platform, for example, how do we as funders really move the conversation from the theory of what does decolonization of knowledge mean to getting practical in the discussions about what are some of the mechanisms in how we support grant making, particularly collaborative grant making, that needs to make life easier for our partners to be able to lead this process. And then really implement those. I think there's been a lot of conversations about pushing for more gender and inclusion, pushing for more interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary research, but the intersectionality piece is lacking. And then the really last one, and I'll pass it on to Marcus. I think the fourth principle of intersectional research for me being how do we centralize participants' voices and concerns really begets a conversation, which I don't hear often, about how does knowledge translation and research uptake need to consider intersectionality. And Sibiwa talked about research and action being more intertwined. So this begets a commitment from organizations like IDRC to really intentionally position partners that are the less usual suspects in policy and scientific fora. It compels us to go to less traditional scientific and policy fora, more localized, and it compels us to really examine the scale of the impact we seek to be more predominantly local, because it wants to be contextualized. The research needs to be contextualized, so does the uptake push. And to be careful that as we want to have policies that are well integrated and really consider all these different elements of oppression and privilege, that we don't always assume that the power relationships and who takes responsibility for uptake needs to be traditional actors. In the case of one of the projects that I was supporting with LGBTQ groups in Colombia, they had a better perception of their rights from FARC than they did from the government in the peace process. They felt their identities were better respected by one actor than the other. So I think that forces a responsibility to really emphasize who do we want the actors to receive our results and mobilize them to be those that are really empowered and respected by the local communities to carry the torch. And often they might not be government, or they might be private sector, they might be local organizations, and we have to be mindful of not making assumptions in those power relations as well. I'll pass it over to Marcus.
Thank you so much. So my name is Markus Gottsbacher. I'm also an IDRC team member. And of course, for me, it's a little bit difficult after these excellent presentations to come up with really new things. But I'm going to maybe to add on, especially what my colleagues have said on, and also, and maybe to reinforce some of the points. So I think we at IDRC, we're really honored that we work with, with grantees and also with communities in situation of vulnerability. And that we have this opportunity, and it's our mandate to really help them theorizing and to write up their stories, their findings, their recommendations, their methodological and theoretical thinking, because this is so much needed. How we can enhance this thinking from the global south, and especially from the communities who live in this context of. And I would say that from local communities, the term intersectionality, of course, does not have a meaning. But they live this in their daily experiences, and I think it's so important to make this visible and to connect, especially also not only the, talking lots of vulnerabilities, but also of course of the agencies, of the strengths of these communities, and really to to enhance these agencies and connect them. So, and I think for an donor like grant making, like IDRC, it's I think what is really a core principle is really to be humble, to really be humble. That we really need a nuanced understanding and approach, and really listen to people. Listen to people and create opportunities and safe spaces. So I think what is so important, and Alejandra just alluded to this also, is to really put people at the center. Just saying that what is really needed is really to put people at the center and have empathy for the integrality of their lives, and build research and the grant makings, of course, around the identities and agencies, and not the other way around. Because this is so typical for many, I think, grant makers, that the people and the grantees have to adapt completely, and not the other way around, as it should be. So I think also, if you talk about donors, I think they are, taking this from, we have gender markers at IDRC, where we say there are projects, initiatives who are gender blind, gender aware, gender sensitive, gender transformative and responsive. The same could also be applied to the term intersectionality. So I would say from intersectionality, being blind, to really empowering and being responsive, assertive, and also transform through the blind intersectionality lens. So I think what is needed in an organization, a grant-making organization like IDRC, is really to hold stock. What have we been doing, but in a coordinated and systematic way, because I think then also we apply this as a lens, as we heard it already, and there's no one size fits all model. But of course, there are some also within POs. There are some POs, especially those who have social science background, who apply this in a much better way, because they have this tool, they have been trained, they're sensitive, they're aware, than others who don't maybe have this social science background. And I think, but it's not, we can't only stop with being aware and having good intentions. Actually, having good intentions can also cause more harm than good. We can contribute to this re-victimization, re-stereotyping, and focus entirely on vulnerabilities only, and not at the strengths and agencies. So I think this is also very important to see. And I think, of course, we need to revamp our systems, the policies, the practices, how we do our programming, grants administration models, the project approval process, M&E processes, knowledge translation, transfer processes, etc. So I think we have to be very aware, how can we do better to establish more collaborative models, because there's lots of power how we identify, how we select topics, research topics, whom we support, whom we don't support, also how we, which grants projects we approve, how we shape these researches, and also how we accompany these researches. The hands-on approach, I would say, is very important. And of course, we need very deep ethical thinking about this, and also Alejandro mentioned this, the safeguarding principles, which should be also constructed, built up in a collaborative way with our grantees. And I think what is also very much important for grant makers is also to look inwards, of course. So how is our institution reflect intersectionality internally also? To what extent can we improve that? How can we address our own stereotypes, prejudices, and also revisit and work on them all the time? I think this is so much important, and dismantle them in an intentional way. And also what we heard, I think is so important, I just want to stress it again, go beyond inclusivity, not adding up only different identities, really to pursue not an homogenizing, point of view, but in a reductionist way, but really look at the interrelations of the complex social markers, identities, power relationships, and once again, also agencies. So be more systemic, more holistic about this, and really listen to the people. And I would say it's so important also to support the development of intersectional lenses led and driven by the Global South. What Adrian has been leading, and all the case studies is, I think, a very good examples, because it's so important to learn and to facilitate also the learning and the exchange between our Global South partners among them, between them, and in terms of methodological and theoretically theme building and practice building, and how can we also learn from decolonized approaches and localized approaches, because IDRC, we're also promoting very much, of course, for instance, localization of research. So how can we connect all these lenses in a meaningful way? And I think what is also very important is be very, and I just want to add up, as I'm saying, it's of course difficult if we talk about transformation, power transformation. If we really influence and disturb and stir up these power imbalances, but what happens next? To think of the consequences. Are we putting communities at the risk? How to mitigate this? Also, I think we have to be very much aware of what's coming next as a donor, because there's lots of responsibility, of course. And I just want to say, it's very important also, if you're thinking of not only of interdisciplinarity, but also thinking of interdisciplinarity in an inter-epistemological way. How can we move away from this universal to pluriversal thinking, especially thinking of indigenous peoples and Afro-descent peoples' knowledges, wisdom, and also sciences. So that we need a critical praxis, and funders need to embrace these different thinkings and sciences of people, and especially of those in conditions of vulnerability. Right. And I just want to say, what's so important is also, instead of superficial assertiveness of positionality, consider deep reflections on the complicity, move away from the extremism of Western scientific positivism. So really to think of restorative and reparative ways of engaging with these communities. And this is not my thinking, this actually was, I think, is from a very good article published by Ghani and Khan, which talk about this positionality statements as a function actually of coloniality. I think this is so much, so important to really interrogate our reflexive thinking. What does really mean the power and the privileges we hold as a power, as a donor and grant making. So, and with regards to the movement building, I think IDRC is and should become, of course, a leading agency and a broker between global North and South, but especially, also facilitating the exchange and the learning between the grantees South-South, and particularly on research with an intersectional lens. So I think this is so important, and we should not reinvent the wheel of, other donors are doing similar things, but we should really be a leading voice and really to connect these different partners at all different levels. So thank you so much. And you know, it was a little bit complex because many things I wanted to say have been already very well articulated by my predecessors. Thank you so much.